but he was having a big tattoo party at his place, and Terry wanted to go, and I wasn't really excited about going. And it was after a show, he said, yeah, big tattoo party at my place, but if you go, you've got to get ink. That's the thing. You can't get in the door unless you get branded for life. That was his words, quote unquote. I remember that. He was on the mic and he said, you've got to get branded for life if you want to hang out at this party. Yeah, wow. And that was at a show at Adams Avenue Theater. Black Flag was playing that night. So that was about 87, around there, if I can remember right. And we did show up there, and we're in the parking lot. And I go, Terry, let's just hang out at the car and, you know, drink and snort crank, you know, out here, and, you know, and just see what happens. I want to look at some of these tattoos before I go under the needle, you know, because I didn't know who was actually doing them. And one kid came out. I forget his name. I think his name was Squirrel or something. It was a nickname. Anyway, he was showing this skeleton or skull that he got on his forearm here, and you know, we were looking at it with lighters, and I could tell just by looking at it, it didn't look like a fucking skull. It looked like a pumpkin. and I don't know who was doing the ink slinging in there. It wasn't Marc. It was just at his place. But we just decided we'd hang out in the parking lot, you know, because I said, I'm going to wait till that son of a bitch gets better. Maybe he'll drink less, or throughout the night, you know, he'll get warmed up, you know, but we never even did go into that party.
So Marc is sitting on this very sofa, in fact, didn't look like this, on that end of it, and he's like sleeveless, and he's got all these fabulous tattoos. So my mother, who thinks because it's Hollywood and everything is theatrical, she went over to Marc and she put her finger on there and she goes, oh, that's really a nice decal. And he goes, that's real. You know, he has this deep voice, that's real. And I remember my mother going, ah! like her finger was on fire.
Marc had started tattooing out of a shop called Mayhem over, I think it was on 3rd or on Beverly, over close to La Cienega. And I knew that he was tattooing, and he told me one night at a party, dude, you got to come in. I need my friends who have tattoos to let me work on them and trust me to do work on them. And because, you know, I can't get walk-in people to come in right away. I can do little chingas. He always called them chingas. Little tattoos, little things, you know. And he goes, I'll give you a good deal on a tattoo. If you come over, I'll charge you $20 for the whole tattoo. Well, he did this tattoo right here, the shamrock with the flames. And his flames are always beautiful. Through the years, they got better and better.
I was also starting a tattoo career, whatever. That's what you do when you run out of money. Anyways, we're both doing tattoos, and we're building our Flash portfolio. You build a little book of Flash, your own little designs. And I just remember looking through his book and still being blown away by, you know, this is like the last time I've seen him. And I looked at his book and I went, whoa, my God, he was still coming up with stuff that was just blowing my mind.
I got this tattoo from him. Well, this was like, at the time he wasn't working in the shop or anything. He came up with this Dr. Seuss kind of Sacred Heart thing. And that was like I think he was telling me that I wanted to be the first person that got a tattoo from him, and I was adamant. A couple of people had gotten to him first, so this was, I believe, the 3rd tattoo he'd done, and he said that I should be thankful because the other ones didn't turn out so good. When I got the first tattoo done on the corn, it was when he and Hope were in the process of breaking up, so he's like tattooing me on the phone, fighting with her, you know, and getting up behind the knee, you know, and it was just bad. I'll never forget that. Yeah, oh yeah, he was just like multitasking, you know. Did it get painful? Yeah, it was bad, and he was digging in a little extra deep because he's in this aggravated situation. You know.
Would you dare to go, hey,
Oh man, it was the fight or flight, man. I was trying to crawl off the table, and he grabbed my leg and pulled me back down, you know.
When the first time I met Mark, I was this dumb little punker kid with green hair. Yeah, it was pretty interesting. You know, it was at Santa Monica Civic. You know, like hitched a ride with some friends out there trying to get into the show, trying to like do whatever you can to sneak backstage. And I was the only one who had the model approach. I went and talked to the guy. I yelled at the guy behind the fence and go, "Hey, is there anything I can do to get in the show?" And I guess he kind of showed sympathy on me because I actually asked him instead of like jumping the fence and trying to get in. He said, "What, you really want to do something?" I'm like, "Yeah." He's hand out these flyers. Okay. I went and handed out the flyers. I didn't throw them all in the garbage. I handed them out. You know, an hour later, I went back and yelled at him again because he was hanging out, you know, partying with the rest of them. "Did you hand them out?" "Yeah." "All of them?" "Yeah." "You didn't throw them in the trash, did you?" "No." "Come on in." Yeah, and there was this dumb little punker kid running around backstage, you know, seeing all these bands from New York. I saw the Misfits, you know. It was like legendary Misfits who would only perform on certain times of the year, and they were playing with Black Flag, and all three singers came back. It was Chavo, Dez, and Henry, and they were, I guess, from what Mark was telling me that day, they were trying to get Keith to come back, but they couldn't do it, or for some reason he didn't want to do it, or whatever. A buddy of mine from the old Burbank punk scene, Woody, was working at this tattoo shop called Lonesome Rose, and I would go hang out with Woody there. And I guess Woody got fired and was real close with the owner, which was a nice lady named Sherry, and was running into Mark periodically saying, "Hey, what's up? Hey, what's up?" And then he went to that shop to work. So it was like you were, you know, me and myself and the other guy that works here, Dave, we both worked at that shop answering phones, you know, picking people's brains, doing whatever we can to like learn to be better tattoo artists and whatnot. And I took after Mark. And I guess Dave took after Sherry, the other lady that worked there, because she did really soft watercolor stuff, and I was more impressed with the big tough guy, hard outline, big bright color, you know. He always had a great way of explaining how you should do stuff, you know. He would hurt your feelings, but he didn't do it just to hurt your feelings to be mean. He would hurt your feelings to make you wake up. You know, he would say, "Yeah, it's nice, but you can't tattoo that." And he would get, "Well, why not?" "Well, you can't get all that stuff in a tattoo. As the years go on, it's going to be gone. It's going to be all muddy."
First was familiar with him through some of his artwork.
What artwork?
Battalion of Saints stuff, you know, the Offspring cover that he did, Misfits, of course. First I met him at my friend Sherry's tattoo shop, Lonesome Rose, that was on Quangun Sunset, and he was employed there for a little period of time. And she actually asked me about him because when I was working for her, she knew that I was into punk rock music and the punk rock scene. So she goes, "Hey, what do you know about this guy?" I go, "I know, you know, he has really cool artwork. I know he's been around for a long time, and he seems like a really interesting guy." I didn't get the chance to meet him. I was quite younger than he. I guess the first time I met him I was 21 years old or so. You know, at first it's just things are very casual. I don't want to go up and go, "Oh my God, you're the guy who drew all these record covers, and you're such an awesome artist." I don't want to go bombard him with with compliments. Just I'm much more into things happening very, very naturally, and however things grow. It was pretty fascinating knowing him. It was sort of sad, just different people talk about sometimes his past and his troubles, and just I think a very large part of his life was a struggle. And
why do you think that?
Or I mean, just people talking about just him sometimes going out and getting in a lot of fights, and flying off the handle here and there, or different drug problems. But I never really knew him for that, fortunately. I mean, me not doing drugs, I'm glad that I don't, because when you do drugs, I think you're like a magnet, and everybody else, when they're using, sort of gravitate towards you. But when you're sober and you don't do drugs, I think sometimes people respect that, and if they're using, they aren't going to come over to your house with a loaded or anything. They're gonna respect that, and you sort of get the fortunate aspect of being able to know them for who they are when they're sober, when drugs aren't playing a factor in their life. I think that's a very one fortunate thing of being sober, is that you're around people. I think when it's their better half, their sober part. I mean, I think sometimes when people are sober, I'm sure they can get really pissed and agitated if they're coming off of something. But I think you can truly meet with people when they're in a clearer mind and they can think better, and drugs aren't really playing a factor in their heads. So pretty much all the time that I was around him, he wasn't using, which was, I feel very fortunate for having that. So the shop that we were working at when we were working at Lonesome Rose, when that finally closed down, Sherry left town without much of a notice, and the shop was pretty much left there. It was like, show up to work, okay, shop's closed. It was a semi-revolutionary shop. It was just very, very cool and unique, filled with a couple great artists, and it was a lot of fun. It meant a lot to me, and I wanted to keep it alive. And I had $5,000 saved up or something. I was ready to drop my whole life savings to keep the shop alive. And Mark sort of said, hey, let's look at things. Let's put it all down on paper here and figure everything out. And he made a list of things. Whenever I make a list now for ordering things, a lot of times I think of him, because he sort of sat there and broke it all down a little bit more and said, hey, this is cool. I'm behind you on this. This would be this could be a good thing, but let's look at it for what it is. We need these supplies. We need to do this and that. And finally we sort of ended up passing on the idea, and the shop closed down. But I think he had a good sense. He was very wise. He was able to just sort of slow things down, look at things with a clear mind, and be able to deal with them with the best way that was necessary. And it seemed very wise. And I really felt a strong bond to him, and I don't feel that he was. I don't feel like he was bullshit. When you talk to him, you could get the impression that if he didn't like you, he let you know, and he always spoke his mind very freely. It wasn't anything fake or unreal. But I remember afterwards he went and got a job somewhere on Hollywood Boulevard, and I was keeping in touch with him. Hey, how's everything going? He goes, oh, he ended up getting in a fight at that shop, and I sort of expected him to mellow out a little bit. My encounters with him were always pretty mellow and pretty happy, and he went and he was working at this just tourist shop, and I remember he was telling me about the owner, the manager, was coming over, looking over his shoulder and just watching what he was doing. He's like, okay, that's cool. He goes, it's this guy's shop. And then one of the other artists, I guess he didn't like too much. And the other artist came over and was looking over his shoulder, and Mark was like, hey, what the fuck are you doing? And the guy's like, well, he's here. And he goes, yeah, he owns a fucking shop. What are you doing looking over my shoulder? And he was telling me about this. I guess he threw the guy across the counter or something. And it was pretty funny because, yeah. It was pretty funny. I guess the guy, was a younger sort of, younger hard-ass kid or whatever. And he didn't know what Mark was capable of, I guess. And I think he might broke his nose or something. I don't know what it was, but he's like, yes, I'm not working there anymore, and he was just sort of bouncing around a little bit, and that was pretty, that was a sort of story that, I'd hear stories from his past, just random stories, of him, being this crazy, drunk, or being this crazy guy going out drinking and fighting and blah blah blah, and I thought he was older and wiser, but there was still that side of him that I guess couldn't be squashed.
And I open the door, and I see, the first person I see is Donnie Pocho, and then right behind him is Marc Rude. And we were both, he didn't know that I lived at Disgraceland, or maybe he did, but I don't think he put two and two together. He knew that I lived at this crazy place. And we were just like, hi. We were really happy to see each other. One thing led to another. I believe he spent the night and then left. Something happened. Either we stayed at Disgraceland or we went back to his place on Western and Melrose. But we ended up spending the night together. And it was really great. And he said, you know what? The next day when we parted ways, he was like, I definitely want to see you again. This has been really great, blah, blah, blah. Let's change numbers, but I'm going to Mexico tomorrow, and I'll be back in a week. And I was like, great. So he goes, but I'll call you from there, and we'll get you souvenirs, whatever. And so a month goes by, and nothing, no word from him at all. That motherfucker, what a dick. I knew it all along. I should have just remembered my first impression, maniac, and which still held through.
Okay, we're at a bar, and we're all sitting there getting hammered. Wetback comes up and he throws the wallet on the table, and he goes, "When you guys dropped your wallet?" We go, we're all looking at it going, "No." But then of course, we're gonna go, "Hey, is there any money in there?" So we picked the wallet, looked to see if there's any money, and there's no money in it. 2 minutes later, the cops come in, Mexican cops come in. They go, "Hey, you guys, how'd you get this wallet? You stole this wallet." It was like 2 Marines, probably about 5 tables away, that one of them lost the wallet. That's because it was his wallet.
Here comes the bartender with the wallet pointing at Mark.
He went to jail, he took him. We jumped straight home, went back up to LA. I had a 57 Chevy at the time. Sold that thing for just enough, I sold it fast, like the next day, So I sold that, got a ride back down, went down there. It took like 5 days for his court appearance.
He gets out of there and he's just like beat. He just looks like hell. Like, not like physical abuse, just the sheer, like him being in the jail that it's like dirty. He said there's like a hole in the ground. That's where everybody pisses and shits. And it's just nasty. And he's just mentally just torqued about it. He's visibly shaken.
He was just shattered, man. I'd never seen that dude like that in my life. He's crying, just so happy. He'd been sitting in a little cell with a bunch of guys who don't speak English, with one hole in the center where they shit and piss, with no lights, for 4 days. It was like crazy.
So then after that, we literally we just got together, and at that point there was really no separating us.
He told me that this being in jail, it was a blessing because it was a pivotal moment in his life where he didn't know, he had $15. And how many days was he in jail? Or it was 3 days, 5 days, 6 days. It was scary because he was in I think he said an 11 by 6 cell, and he said there were usually like 20 other guys in there just crowded together. And they gave them a gallon of water a day to share. And so somehow he managed to survive eating little pieces of tortilla, and he said he didn't go to the bathroom for 3 days. So I guess that's how long he was in, 3 days. And while he was there, he thought this could be the end. He could be lost in the Mexican prison system, one of those horrible stories. And so he was thinking about his son and just what he needed to do with his life, and if he ever got out, or if he could get out. Ever got out is wrong. If he could get out, if he was going to have the luck to somehow find a way out there to get out of there with his $15, and so that's when he was. This was soon after he'd met Iris, and he said, I kept on going back to Iris. I kept on seeing her face and just knowing I had to get back to her. And he was always like that. He would talk about their relationship in terms of just it was like Byron or Shelley or something. I mean, he was just so romantic and poetic, and there was something he said about they had a breakup, and he was just talking about, let's just read something here. They wanted to get back together, and I know he said to her, I think I'm falling in love with you again, and she said, I'm in love with you, and he was describing this to me. They're getting back together, and he said, the floodgates were open, but I'm not drowning in her, and she's not drowning me. The water is flowing. And he just said that. And I just thought, he would say things like that on a regular basis. lyrical, and you know, not many people talk like that. And he'd say it in with such sincerity. And he could get away with it. How many people could get away with sitting there going like, the floodgates are open. I'm not drowning first. The floodgates. I don't know.
That's great.
He didn't talk about his family, except when I got a call. He told me when I saw him beat that guy up so bad in the club. I told him that I was amazed that he could fight like he could. That's when he told me how he had to grow up on his own. His dad came into his bedroom one night when he was about 15 and put his service revolver to his head for something really stupid. I think his dad drank a lot too. I think he was drunk at this time. And he told him he was going to kill him. And Mark somehow got out of the house. I don't know if he fought with his father. I don't know if he went out the window. I don't know how he got out, but he got out and he never went back. And he hated his father.
So he left his house home when he was 15?
When he was 15, in New York. And he was just on his own.
Do you know what he did, or do you know anything about that? What might have happened?
He didn't want to talk. He didn't like to talk about it. I think it was just really hard. He probably, I don't know. He probably lived like a lot of homeless kids do, hand to mouth. He probably stole to survive. I don't know this either. Again, it's just my summation.
But he did say he left his home.
He left his home. He just couldn't stand it anymore, and he knew that it was get out or his father was truly going to kill him. And he said he knew that night that he would have died that night if he wouldn't have left.
He hated his dad, and that was an issue with a gun. His dad pulled a gun on him, and then his dad was a cop, and Mark even threw some ethnic slurs down on his own dad. And Mark was Jewish, and so Mark would be explaining about his dad, and he would become an anti-Semite for a little minute, of all things. Yeah, so he took off, and he never came back.
I would go to his apartment sometimes, and it was really weird. Like, you would never see his mother or father. They were always hidden away in the bedroom. Okay, the door closed, and you never saw them. They had a living room in their apartment, and their living room literally looked like a museum. Everything had plastic covers on it. You weren't allowed in the living room, and you weren't allowed to touch anything in the living room. So you would have to go in his apartment, make a right turn, and make a beeline to his room, which he shared with his grandmother. Now, his grandmother was great. His grandmother was this nice little old lady. I remember her well, and he loved her very much. They were very close. But nothing about the mother or father. You never heard anything or saw anything about them. Now, when he would come to my house for dinner, and he would come, I couldn't sleep over his house. Okay, he could come over, he could sleep over my house. We would feed him. He'd have dinner at our house and everything. So he knew, my mom and my brother and sister. But there was no way of really knowing his mother or father. This is as early as 14, 15 years old. That's how invisible they were. They never even came out to say hi to me or talk to any of his friends. They didn't want anything to do with anybody. And intentionally. We were all, I think in his eyes, we were all scum. He was a cop, whatever. But what kind of a human being was he? He had no interest in his son's life at all. And from what I understand, didn't have any interest in his daughter's life either. His dad was a cop in New York, okay, and they had a really bad relationship. His father, there were times where I would see bruises on Mark, and I'd ask what happened. Mark wouldn't want to talk about it, but basically he'd tell me, his dad threw him out again. He had no place to stay. He'd come and stay at our house, and he actually lived at different times for as long as maybe a month or so. And then I would like to think that maybe his mother was saying something to his father about letting Mark come home, and then they would let Mark come home. But the mom really never defended Mark, never stuck up for him. I never even knew this woman. All I knew is from what Mark told me. And the fact is, though, that they were never, ever in his life. And this even goes on to later when we did get in trouble and we were in jail and we had to appear in court. They never appeared in court. They never came to help him. It was really literally my mom who basically helped him so that he would get bailed out all the time. And even when we did get into major trouble, the judge basically would be lenient with Marc because my mom would vouch for Marc and say that, you know, she was going to keep an eye on him. And his mother is just as guilty because she never defended Marc. My family, we moved to Yonkers. I was, I believe, going into 8th grade. So I was probably about 13 years old or something. We moved to Yonkers and we lived on Warburton Avenue in Yonkers. And we were in a group of buildings. There was probably at least 3 or 4 buildings in a row. And my family lived in the first building, and I believe Marc lived in the 3rd building. And he was just one of the first kids that I met in our, you know, our group of buildings and stuff that I started hanging out with. Him and there was another guy named Keith. But we immediately became friends. We just immediately started hanging out all the time. I don't know if it's because we both were from the Bronx. I don't know if it was both because we were both Jewish to some degree. But we had a natural, you know, friendship right from the very beginning. We went to the same high school, Gorton High School in Yonkers. We were in the same grade, but we weren't always in the same classes. Marc was like a very smart kid. Okay, he was like one of those guys that like, he didn't have to do homework, but he would do well on tests. You know, he would get good grades even though he wasn't in class half the time. He was just naturally, he was extremely intelligent. He was very sharp as a tack. Marc like really loved like creepy magazines, eerie magazines. He used to draw, and his drawings were every bit as good as what the artists were doing in those magazines at the time. He loved like horror, you know, we both did, you know, I loved more like Wolfman, Frankenstein and stuff. He liked the really gory stuff. And, you know, when we were 13, 14, and we're starting to get into all the rock and roll that was going on, you know, there's bands that you just, you know, these are the bands that we followed. And I remember, it's funny, at the time, the Grateful Dead and Jefferson Airplane were real big. This, of course, led to another fight that we had, physically. You know, I was a huge Jefferson Airplane fan, okay, and Marc was a huge Grateful Dead fan. Now, this is a time when, as hippies, we were wearing like work boots, jeans, flannel shirts, okay, because that was a part of the hippie thing in the beginning. You know, it kind of started changing later as the looks started changing, the styles started changing. You know, later on, Marc, yeah, I remember one of Marc's favorite groups later on was T-Rex. Okay, well, T-Rex was practically a glitter band, okay, but he liked T-Rex, you know, he liked Mark Bolan, you know, and he was into that. You know, David Bowie, you know, that came along later, so we were no longer wearing flannel shirts, blue jeans, and work boots. But, you know, in the beginning, that's what we were into.
You said MC5 too earlier.
MC5 was kind of in the middle. You had that, you know, Detroit rock and roll. You know, you have MC5, Amboy Dukes. I remember Marc liking the Amboy Dukes, Deep Purple. There were groups like that. But they were really still kind of considered second rate compared to like the main guys. There was always Dylan, Clapton, Hendrix. Okay. We used to fight about this physically. Okay, like we would get into fights. No, Jefferson Airplane's better, Marc. No, Grateful Dead's better. No, look at this song, look at this album. Boom, next thing, boom, boom, boom. We're fighting, we're on the grass. And this is what happened. It's like, it's so funny because when I think back, you know, you think you would never accept that in your life as a friend, that this is what you do with them. But it never fazed me because I knew the loyalty was there. I knew the friendship was always there. We just were very passionate about what we believed in. And if it led to blows once in a while, it led to blows, you know. That's just the way it was.
Why do you think he was so like...
I don't know if it's that he adopted his friends as family because his family sucked so bad. You know, I mean, that might, you know, I'm not a psychologist. I'm not going to try to be one. But I think that, you know, for us, you know, yeah, I always cared about my mom. But, you know, we were out of the house. Don't forget, we were out of our houses 14, 15 years old, sleeping in the parks, you know, doing drugs, having, you know, relationships. We were already independent and self-sufficient to some degree on our own, you know, at 14 and 15, at 17 even more so. So we were family with each other. You know, we had hair down, you know, Marc had a huge afro. Marc used to use, you know, all different kinds of afro picks that were always in his back pocket. pocket, and he'd always be like teasing his afro out. And I'm not exaggerating when I say like his afro was out to like here, you know. And you know, he loved Jimi Hendrix, and I think that that was part of it. But we were just wild. We were wild. We dressed. You know, I wore nothing but an auto mechanic's overalls for the last 2 years of high school that I had tie-dyed in a tub. You know, Mark always had incredible, like, you know, girls used to give us jewelry. So in those days, like, girls would give us like silver bracelets and rings, earrings for our ears. You know, so Mark and I always had like necklaces, you know, with little Coke spoons on them, and, you know, silver bracelets and rings and things like that. We were cool. We looked very cool, and we looked wild. You know, it's like whether we were wearing fringe jackets or, you know, tie-dye shirts and stuff like that, we were totally into that whole lifestyle, and we were living it. You know, we didn't spend a lot of time in school, as little time as possible. Most of our time was spent outside of school. You know, we'd be up at a park that we used to hang out at, and we'd, you know, be into really just talking about music and politics and, you know, civil rights movement. You know, we were involved in sit-ins for black people to get African American studies courses in school, in high school. And, you know, Mark was really into that, you know. And the biggest thing him and I did was he and I got together with a few other people. We went around to like 5 different high schools in the county. We put together this anti-Vietnam War demonstration. We ended up holding this demonstration in front of Yonkers High School. And one of our guest speaker came. He was from Kent State, and talk about, you know, what had happened with the shootings there. And we organized that. Mark and I organized that whole thing. My mom even was responsible for printing out the flyers for it at her job on an old Xerox machine in those days. None of you may know what a Xerox machine is, but it makes copies. And so we, you know, we did all that, and it turned into a big riot. There was tear gas. We marched from the high school to the draft board. People were burning draft cards, and tear gas was used by the police. And, you know, I don't know if it was hundreds, but a lot of people were arrested. We were not arrested. We were, you know, we very much believed in a book we had read that Mark loved. This guy, his name was Abby Hoffman, some people say, who was really big, one of the Chicago 7. And he had written this book called Steal This Book. And one of the things he wrote in this book, and I remember Mark and I talking about it, and it said, you know, the main job of a revolutionary is not to ever get caught. Greasers were the guys that were still driving around like in 57 Chevys, okay, with their hair slicked back with grease in it, hence the word greasers, and, you know, leather jackets and sunglasses. And they would love nothing more than to find guys who looked like hippies to beat up, you know, and they would use excuses like, oh, you know, you want to burn the American flag, or, you know, you're a communist, and blah, blah, blah. And that would be it. They didn't need a reason. If they saw you on the street, if you weren't with a group of people, there was a good chance there was going to be a fight. Probably 4 or 5 of us. Two of the guys, like I talked about, who were very peaceful, loving, nice guys, you know, but didn't know how to fight, didn't know from fighting from anything else. All of a sudden, there appeared like 5 or 6 guys who were probably in their mid-20s, who were what we call greasers. And they came up to one of my friends, his name was Keith, who was a very, very fragile little guy with long curly hair, wouldn't hurt a fly. And for some reason, they started picking on him, okay? I believe my friend Vinny Laporta was also there, who was the guitar player from Lou Reed's band, who also was a very, you know, gentle soul. You know, didn't fight, would never get into a fist fight. They started picking on Keith and Vinny, and all of a sudden, Mark and I, you know, just said, hey, you know, you need to leave them alone. They're not doing anything. Just leave us alone. There's no problem. Boom. Immediately, these guys jumped on me and Mark, okay? All I remember from this fight is 2 guys holding me down on the hood of a car, and the 3rd guy punching my face in repeatedly, okay, many, many times. And as I'm looking over to the side out of my eye, I see Mark there, and I see him, like, you know, 2 guys like beating the hell out of him, and they threw him into this fire hydrant, and he was like wrapped around it laying on the street. They threw us into, like, there was a diner there. They threw us into the window. Somebody in the diner called the police. The police showed up. these guys started fighting with the police. Okay, so Mark and I are now free to lay there on the ground, in agony. And these guys are fighting the police, and there's like 2-3 police cars, and they finally get these guys in handcuffs. This literally actually appeared in the newspaper the next day, that there was this incident that happened. Since they saw that we were victims, they basically, for the only time that I ever remember in my life that the police were nice to us, came over and asked us if we needed any help, or if we even needed a ride. And the last thing we ever wanted to do was be in the back of a police car. So we said, no, thank you, we'll go on our merry way. To this day, I remember my mother crying when she saw my face because you could not recognize me to save your life. Mark was like, walking with a limp for days. He was like, his back was completely screwed up from this fight. So that was the kind of thing, we dealt with. Normally we would have been with like 2 or 3 other guys that could fight as well as us, and it would have been more of an even match, and maybe they might not have even bothered us. But they would just look to see how weak the group looked and attack. And he was a great fighter, and actually I say we were pretty equally matched, so I was a pretty good fighter myself. But he was quicker than me. He was like fast as could be. And just like pummel somebody, who was attacking us, and make them sorry for it, and make them realize, oh, maybe we shouldn't harass the hippies. Maybe it's not a good idea. And that was our point too. It's like, if we get into a fight, I had guys in bars, want to come at me, and people hold them back. And I'd say, you know what, let them go. And it's like, you figure if enough things like that happen, that eventually these people will leave you alone because they realize they're going to get seriously hurt. I have no qualms about laying somebody out if they're attacking me just because of the way I friggin' look. And Mark was exactly the same way. Exactly the same way. As we got older, we started doing heavier drugs and we were drinking. Now, Mark was very much in control. Mark did not get out of hand a lot. He did not go into blackouts. He did not get totally destroyed and wasted. He pretty much, for the most part, always controlled himself and had a good head on his shoulders, and did as much stuff as everybody else, but knew how to do it where it wasn't going to incapacitate him, if that's the right word, the way it did me. I had a full-blown major drug alcohol problem, and I did black out a lot. And one thing I will say is that as wasted as I ever got, Mark was always there with me to help me. Okay, he never would leave me anywhere. He would always make sure somehow I got home in one piece. This was a guy, and one of the reasons I'm doing this is because I want everybody to know, like, this was a guy that was you could not ask for a more loyal friend. You could not ask for to be friends with somebody that always had your back, was always there for you, no matter what happened. And if 10 giant guys came up to try to beat me up because of the way I looked or something, Mark, before I even get a chance to lift a fist, Mark would have already flown into them and started wailing away. I mean, that's just how he was. And the same thing went for any of our friends. We did have friends that were hippies that were like peace, love, and flowers and all that didn't know how to fight and stuff. I think it's because Mark and I came from the Bronx, that maybe we had been in fights in school earlier on. We weren't scared of fighting, and we weren't scared to defend ourselves. And we weren't scared to defend our friends. And Mark was always there for his friends. He always defended them, and he never let people take advantage of his friends.
Mark has a son named Lauren, and at that time Lauren was probably about 6, 7 years old, something like that. And he went to school up the street in Golden Hill. And Mark didn't have a car. He never drove. I don't think he even knew how, actually. But he was from New York, so that was something he wouldn't do. And so when Lauren would stay with us, I would take him to school in the morning. I don't know if Lauren would remember me or not, but at that time he was just this cute little blonde kid. And that's just an interesting side of Mark, that he was a dad.
About a year after I knew him, I knew that he had been married and had a son. He was just a little kid when I met him. He was probably like 4 or 5 years old.
I used to love it when he'd come down here and he'd have his son with him, like at the shows and stuff at the Fairmont Hall and stuff. And I just used to be amazed, look at him, man, he's got a son with him and stuff. But
How old is his son?
his son was about probably 4 at the time. I remember the first time seeing him, and that was a fear Fear played at Fairmont Hall, and that was the first time that I saw him bring him to a punk gig.
One time we went to see Tarzan, Lords of Greystoke. Lord of Greystoke, something like that. We brought Nigel. Nigel was just a baby. He's just, your son? Yeah, Nigel's my son. He was about 1, a little over 1. And we brought him to the movies, and Lauren was into breakdancing. Lauren was real preppy. Lauren had shirts, even at 6 and 7 years old, shirts looked like they were freshly ironed. You know, pleated jeans, pressed jeans. I mean, the kid was like, you know, his perfect little short haircut with his perfect little hair. He was just gorgeous. And Lauren was real into breakdancing. And here's his dad, and he's all punked out with all his chains and his leather. And then, you know, I was the pop princess. I had all my little foo-foo stuff on and little girly stuff on. And Nigel, well, he's just a baby, you know. So we were really the odd-looking couple on the bus going to see the movies. And Lauren's out there spinning on his back, trying to get his dad to break dance. Come on, Dad, it's easy. Right.
You know, but he'd always get hassled by the cops, and I kind of like witnessed that like several times over like the next decades. And it was in front of like a club, and I looked really young, and they just assumed I was just some underage girl that he was like on the make for, and actually we were just out there talking, and it wasn't even anything like real intense. And you look at the debauchery in Hollywood, and at that time, it's just like what was going on at the cafe was the least of the police's worries. All kinds of perverts in Hollywood, and the least they could do is just like drive down to Sunset and bust like some real perverts instead of bothering Mark in front of a club with just talking to me, and I wasn't even underage. At one point, though, and this goes back to him getting hassled, and I seem to be the witness to this a lot, is I got a phone call, and he was like, Sarah, get down here. And I'm like, what are you talking about? He's like, you need to get down here. And so I was like, okay. And so it was like this tattoo parlor on Hollywood Boulevard. And it was like really weird. There was like this teenage girl, or like older teens. She could have looked past for like early 20s or so, but she had long blonde hair. And at the time, my hair was long too, and blonde. And she was there with her mother, who was like this totally valley lady, right? And they were like bitching about something, and the cops were there. And I'm like, what is going on? And Mark said, you know, just listen to what's going on. And the mother of this girl, this blonde-haired girl who was underage but didn't look it, was mad, not because, and it wasn't like an underage tattoo issue. She was mad because there was a picture, a drawing that Mark had done and was trying to sell for as a tattoo, with long blonde hair, but she was naked, right? And the mother thought that it was her daughter. So she was getting all bitchy because she thought Mark had drawn a naked picture of her underage daughter. And so Mark's all like, Sarah, take off your clothes. It's her. It's her. It doesn't matter if it was me or her. It's just like, it's kind of this weird censorship thing. And the mother seemed really disappointed. And the cop was there, you know, in the tattoo parlor, like totally supporting the mother. Like, what do you mean? And the mother seemed disappointed. What do you mean by that? When there was another blonde girl who was gonna be the naked person. You know, that was what was weird to me. It was like she was making such a big stink, and the cops were there. And then by the time it was refuted, and no, I did not take off my clothes. By the time it was refuted, she was all like, oh, well, it's not my daughter then, right? Like she was disappointed, and maybe it was just like she was embarrassed, right? I don't know. It was like a really weird deal, and that was in like 1993. And, you know, and I didn't take off my clothes, and it wouldn't even have been necessary, and I mentioned that at the time to the cop. I was just like, anyone can draw any picture they want to, you know, and it seemed like a really weird issue, and he wasn't tattooing it on her, you know, and so you could draw a blonde naked chick if you want to.
He was tattooing a girl, and she stepped outside to have a cigarette, and the police observed a minor smoking, you know, and then so they stopped and asked for ID, and she's like, what are you doing here? And she goes, oh, well, I'm in here getting a tattoo. And so he got in some trouble for that she was a minor, yeah. I mean, how does a fucking police officer driving down the street observe a minor smoking a cigarette? What eagle eye cop is that, you know?